Good day, my name is KEEFtalk, that's my email address and that's my Twitter address, and I use Twitter all the time. Today's KEEFtalk, as you can see, is the first one I'm going to do on leadership. There'll be a follow-up to this where I focus upon further aspects of it, but as you can see, what I'm going to do today is just quite simply try to succinctly try to explain what leadership is about, when it's effective, and try to make sure that people fully understand what we really mean by it. I was fortunate enough to start teaching in 1974 when I was invited, begged, pleaded to go back to my old school. I had a degree in chemistry and I also had a PGCE in PE from Carnegie College in Leeds, and my head of PE and the head of science were very keen for me to go back as a teacher. And I was fortunate enough, with the support of both of those and the head teacher, to within 4 years to become head of department. Now you might think, well, that was the start of my leadership. Well, to some extent I didn't realise at the time what leadership was about because it was thrust upon me, and I didn't really start studying and analysing what leadership was about until a few years later, when I decided that I'd switch from being head of department to being head of year and moved to another school. I'd never applied for a post before, and consequently this was a very steep learning curve for me. I was fortunate because at the same time I was doing a diploma in education and I had access to quite a lot of research. So my research into leadership really began in 1985. And what interested me was the fact that sport was a particularly good area where there'd been a lot of research into leadership. And for myself, who come from a very much a sporting team background, I realised very quickly that I'd actually been in a leadership position from a very young age, because I'd been asked to lead quite a few different teams in different sports. But what allowed me to do was to do a great deal of research into sport, business and politics, two areas which I don't really know very much about. I didn't at the time, but it came clear to me that there were three key parts which went forward to becoming a leader. Quite simply, if you're a leader, it means that others are following you. Fairly straightforward, I suppose, but also the reason that they're following you is because you are the decision maker. I realised that when I was very young that people were following me, not particularly because I wanted them to, but because I was making the decisions and they liked the decisions that I was making and decided to follow what I was doing. The thing was, in those days, as a teenager, perhaps understanding, I didn't really feel I was responsible for their actions. They followed me if they want to, but I took no responsibility. But as a leader, basically I was responsible for their actions, particularly my younger brother, who I got into trouble quite a bit. Anyway, we'll move on to another topic, because it meant that for me, that when I started to help other people understand what leaders were about, I chose a family. Because for me, parents by definition are leaders, because if you look at the previous three, they fit into that. And one of my favourite programmes in the 70s and the 80s was a programme called The Waltons. So I used this many times from the 90s onwards to illustrate to people what leadership is about. And all I did was say, the grandparents of the family and the parents of the family have been perhaps killed in an accident or whatever, and they've got to try and find a foster parent. This meant that they had to look for key things which were going to make them the leader of that particular family. And it helped people understand that, of course, parents, whether they like it or not, have to be leaders, as do teachers. Now this was a crucial part for me because I was very disappointed at how poor the research was into leaders in education in the 80s, and to some extent I still am. But it meant that in other areas I was able to draw upon that, and this cartoon comes from a brilliant book which is called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which I discovered in 1990. And basically what it does is point out that the leader is the person who makes the decisions, who can see where they're meant to go, and is trying to get the others to go in the right direction. Whereas the managers and the workers, or whatever you want to call them, they're the people who are doing a very good job and working very hard, but basically they're not actually knowing the direction they should be going in. And of course a teacher, as with a parent, hopefully they do know what's best for the children and are going in the right direction. Not always true, I know. So consequently, the difference between a leader and a manager is perhaps an important thing to emphasise. Now, I was fortunate enough to come across a business book which is quite well known, and John Cotter is a very well known business guru, and basically this definition comes from this book. Basically, the essence of leading is about bringing about a key change in either the process or the system, or perhaps in a team or a family, and you're trying to bring about a change which is going to cause some improvement. It doesn't necessarily cause that, but that's what leading is about. And at the same time, I was able to use somebody who, again, was quite well known at the time. In fact, he's classified as the father of leadership, Warren Bennis, and he tried to illustrate what the key things about a leader were, and they are basically people who are prepared to do things differently. They're originals, and they innovate. They're trying to develop other people, and they're continually developing themselves. And they're focusing upon trying to get others to follow them because they trust them and believe that they will do things in the long term which will benefit them. That's why effective leaders are very much about people who ask what and why, question all the time what's being imposed upon them, perhaps from other areas. And they're trying to look in the long term. They're not trying to get quick fix and just worrying about short-term results. And therefore you will notice good effective leaders, they're always trying to challenge people who are trying to put pressure on them, and consequently they are perhaps very unusual and don't actually fit in very well, which is part of the problem that we have in public services and in education particularly, that it's not easy to get into a senior position if you challenge things all the time, and consequently you're tending to get lots of managers in leadership, key leadership positions. And that's why they're focused upon doing the right thing rather than just doing things effectively, efficiently. It's important therefore, and I will do much more on the second part, the next second KEEFtalk on leadership, to look at emotionally healthy effective leaders, which has been my main raison d'etre for probably 35 years, because they are different. Because leaders can be people who are despots, they can be people who historically have had a great deal of power and use that power to get others people to do their bidding, but not in an emotionally healthy way. That's why what we really should be after is emotionally healthy leaders who are basically inspiring others. People are following them not because they're forced to, but because they wish to, because they see people, and that's where the behaviour and the role model comes in. They see people who you just think, I want to be like them, or I want to follow them, or I can trust them. That's the key part, being able to trust emotionally healthy effective leaders, and they know that in the long term it's going to benefit them. It may be having to get them to do things which they didn't particularly want to do, but in the long term it's going to benefit them. And that's why they are confident that the people who are leading them are going to take responsibility for their actions and their welfare. They're not going to do things which basically are going to do a lot of harm to a lot of people. But when things go well, you're not going to hear them banging on about it. They're going to fade into the background and try to give the credit to the rest of the people in the team or the organisation or in the population. That's why these two quotes are very, very useful in trying to look at emotionally healthy, effective leaders, because they are people who barely take that they're there. They're adding things. They're not for always, forever coming into the limelight. They only come into the limelight when it's crisis time, and when things are successful in the end, they step back, go into the background. And a chap who in recent times has been particularly prominent in trying to explain about leadership, Simon Sinek. This is his most recent book, but from an earlier book, which is again I'd strongly recommend. Those who truly lead are able to create a following of people who act not because they're swayed, but because they were inspired. It's the inspirational part which emotionally healthy, effective leaders are very much about. I've put on here just a dozen books which basically I felt most powerful and most effective, which I would strongly recommend. The sad part of me, there's no education books there because I haven't really found any books from education which I felt can really make a huge difference. But perhaps they're catching up. So one of the crucial parts for me is this book here, Spirodynamics, because this I would advocate to anybody that is in a leadership or hopes to be in a leadership position, because it gives an idea of how important it is to understand the people you're dealing with. Now, that's why these two sporting books are interesting insofar as they are very important, but from a sporting background, but sporting is very much about winning. But the crucial thing about the All Blacks, which this book is there, is they've been winning for 3 decades. Now that's a crucial part of how to understand that effective teams and effective organisations, effective schools or effective whatever it might be, they will have a continually role and a great deal of leaders. People who are emotionally healthy and effective in what they do. And that's why this person here, Jim Collins, which again is from a very important book which I've used many times in the past there, Good to Great, written about 20 years ago, a business book. It has a superb illustration of the research that he did extensively, and he points out that people who are emotionally healthy, effective leaders, they actually demonstrate modesty. They're not showing off. They're not saying how good they are all the time. They're relatively quiet, and they basically try to make sure that the people who are following them get all the credit, so that when they're actually successful in the end, they aren't banging on about it. Other people will do that for them. They've no need to do that. Now that's important, because for me that's essential part of what I mentioned with Spirodynamics. Now, if you don't want to read the book, and the book is quite complex, but the CDs which go with the book are much easier to understand, much longer, but actually give you an idea that if you're trying to understand the people you're leading, then you've got a much better chance of being an emotionally healthy, effective leader. If you're a parent, then look, obviously your children are going to be relatively young to begin with, and they are going to need a lot of development, and therefore they're likely to be over here. If you're in a company and it's working towards profits and things of that nature, they're probably going to be focusing upon life is what we have and what we own, very much about personal things and things of that nature there. What we would like to have from leaders and from people in our company are people who see a much bigger picture, and they're very much about learning, but they are few and far between. And this book here is another one which I can recommend, which again has a different developmental framework, but much the same. And again, understanding that the people that we're dealing with, and at school, most of the children we're dealing with, they are diplomats. They are people who avoid conflict and actually just follow the norms. They are very much in a teenager frame of mind, an adolescent frame of mind, and feel shame if the group of the norms are actually being violated. And for me as an effective teacher, it was crucial to understand that was how the people in front of me were thinking. The teachers not always thought that way, but it's important for understanding who we're dealing with. That's why perhaps education has been a particular problem as far as leadership's concerned, because our hierarchical structure in public services and in education in particular means that we end up with these hero heads, people who are supposedly making the decisions which can affect everybody else. Really what we're after, since all the teachers are leaders by definition, is very much a team ethos, which is of course what the All Blacks are about. That we've got lots and lots of leaders in the team, depending on the time and what we're trying to deal with. And that's why there's been a lot of research, a lot of investment, and many attempts, and I'll deal with that in the next one much more, to try to change the culture that we have in schools. And at the present moment in time, they are struggling and have done for a long time, because they can't shift away from the culture that we've presently got to have in emotionally healthy, effective leaderships and teams. That's why I will finish now, and finish because I'm going to move on to the next one, which is going to be about trying to look at how we can develop effective leaders in the future and try to shift our culture in our society so that these things become the most important thing in the developing of people, well, which means we will have lots more emotionally healthy, effective leaders. I hope you found that useful. I hope you will tune in to other KEEFtalks. Thank you very much.